These are not phone numbers. And these aren't email addresses. Looks like we need to add some form validation. In short, form validation is when the browser or the web server checks to see that the data is in the correct format and within the constraints set by the application before storing it into the system. Looking at Sanity's validation documentation, we can see they give us quite a few things out of the box, like making fields required, setting a min or a max value for a field, displaying custom warning and error messages, and the list goes on. These helper methods make field validation a walk in the park. We also have the ability to create custom validation functions, which can be super helpful as your content types become more robust. As always, a link to these docs can be found in the description below. So, now that we know what's available, let's start with our theater name field. First, let's update it to include our validation property, which we'll pass an anonymous function to. Our anonymous function will take a single parameter, let's call it rule, and for our return value, we'll return a rule. Now let's start on our actual validations. First up, we'll use the required helper to make sure our theater name is required, since a theater document wouldn't make much sense without a name. Next, we want to say that the field itself has a max limit, so we'll use the max helper. Let's cap this field at 70 characters. Now, if we head over to the UI, we can see that this works just fine. If we remove our theater name from the field, we now get an obvious field error. Hovering over this little icon, we see it's a required field. If we were to add a bunch of characters exceeding our 70 character limit, we can see this also hits us with a field error. Must be at most 70 characters long. Ugh. Doesn't really roll off the tongue now, does it? Guys, I do not like these default messages, and your users won't either. We should do something about it. Let's customize the message that appears for each of our scenarios. Let's head back to the IDE. The anonymous function here is allowed to pass either a single rule or an array of rules. So let's break these up and give them different error messages. For the required error, we'll say the theater name is required. And for the maximum of 70 characters rule, we'll say the theater name must not exceed 70 characters. Now, if we head back over to the UI, we can see these in action. If I don't have a theater name and hover over the little icon, we see our custom message there. And same for the max 70 characters error. If we add a bunch of characters here, we can see our custom error there. One more thing to note is that based on the type of failed validation, you'll notice you aren't allowed to publish the document. If we hover over the publish button, we can see we get a message saying, hey, you have a few issues with your content. Fix those first, and then we'll talk about saving. Next up, we have phone field validation. Okay, this one's going to be a little trickier as we need to ensure the text is a proper phone number while still respecting the fact that users may enter phone numbers in several different ways, some of which you saw in the intro. To handle these types of validations, we'll need to use regular expression, which thankfully Sanity gives you as part of validation on string fields. So let's write our regex pattern matcher. Whenever I write regular expression, I like to start off with my most robust variation and start slowly completing the regex matches within it. Starting with our opening syntax, making sure we capture everything using the caret and $ characters. From here, we'll just add our most robust variation of phone number input, including special characters like opening parentheses, spaces, and dashes. Let's first take care of these parentheses since I know I want these to be optional. Next, we can capture our first group of numbers. Area code should always only be 3 numbers, so let's handle that. Now let's move on to the next piece here. I think we're fine accepting either a dash or a space, but also neither, so this takes care of that. Now we'll move on to the next number group. Next group for our dash and space here. And finally, our last group of numbers, and we're all set. Now let's give it an error message. We'll just say phone number must be in the format and let's just apply the format here. That looks good. Let's head back to the UI and test it out. Let's first try something we know wouldn't work, right? Like, can we add letters? How about too few numbers, right? That also doesn't work. Now let's see if our various formats work. How about this one? Yep, looks good. And this one? Yep. What about this one? Also working. That is great. I'm aware that this is also sometimes used, but I personally am not a fan, so I intentionally left it out of our regular expression. Feel free to tweak yours to allow the formats you want in your content. Next up, we have email, which is going to be a lot easier thanks to Sanity. Similar to our theater name validation, we'll be using one of the validation helpers for this email field as well. Say hello to the email helper. Now back in the UI, we can test it out, right? Let's first add something we know isn't a proper email, like maybe this, where we're missing the last part. Or maybe we'll add the last part but miss the @ symbol, for example. Now we'll add a proper email. Works perfectly. Last but not least, I want to add some validation to our movie field. First, let's tackle this the easy way. We want to make sure that users aren't allowed to add duplicates in the field. To do this, we'll leverage another validation helper specifically for the array type. It's called unique. Let's head over to the UI and make sure that works. And as we can see, adding a duplicate value now produces an error on the items that are duplicates. Perfect. But I don't want to stop there. I want to consider my users for just a second. Wouldn't it be nice if they simply couldn't add duplicates? Perhaps we could strip out items they've already added so they no longer appear in a drop-down list. For this, we'll need to do something a bit more custom. As part of the reference primitive, we get a few options. One of them is our filter option, where we're able to apply custom filters to the references being returned in a list. In our case, we'll write some logic that checks the current values in our movies array and only return items that our users have not already selected for this specific theater. So for example, if they've already selected Wall-E and they click this drop-down list, Wall-E will no longer appear in the list. We're going to use a bit of Grok here, which is Sanity's query language. Don't worry if this doesn't make sense yet. We'll be going over it in a lot more detail in a future video. So first off, we have to add our filter to the reference field itself, so let's take care of that. The filter accepts a function that returns a Grok query, so let's first say we only want to return items that have been published. Next is the fun part, in my opinion. We'll say we only want to return items that are not currently added in our movies array, and here we're using specific Grok syntax to pull that off, and that's it. This syntax for querying content in the Sanity data lake is extremely intuitive and easy to read. To get a sneak peek at some of the cool things you can do with Grok, check out Sanity's Grok cheat sheet. I'll add a link to this in the description below. Now, if we head back over to the UI, we can see that once we select a movie, the same movie no longer appears in the dropdown. Bye-bye duplicates and unpublished content. All right, folks, we're going to end it there. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding of what's possible when it comes to form validation in Sanity. See you all in the next one.